Hello, I am Michelle, your librarian and your storyteller for this evening. Today is Valentine's Day. It's a time for romance and lovers, but we won't be reading stories like that. This is a story time for the rest of us. Welcome to Love Stinks, story time for grown-ups. Little gem in the library. It's called It Ended Badly, 13 of the Worst Breakups in History by Jennifer Wright. There are a lot of great stories in here, but I thought I would share the one about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So, if you didn't know, Henry VIII went through a fair few wives. He initially was married to Catherine, and ended up managing to annul his marriage to her because she did not bear him any children. Also because he had spotted Anne Boleyn and quite fancied her. So he did marry Anne Boleyn, and she did give birth to a child. That child was Elizabeth, who became one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But the problem is that child was a girl. So the couple hoped more children would follow, but they did not. Instead, there were 3 miscarriages. This was probably Henry's fault. Some scholars speculate he might have had syphilis, which could have led to his wives' many miscarriages, though at the time, miscarrying was always blamed on the woman and possibly taken as a sign that she was a witch. Following his divorce from Catherine and the religious and political repercussions that followed, Henry was not in a rush to divorce yet another wife. However, Anne possessed a very different personality to Catherine. While Catherine's motto had been humble and loyal, Anne's was the most happy, and she would not stand for unhappiness. While Catherine had looked the other way through Henry's liaisons with other women, Anne raged. This was especially inconvenient, given that as early as 1536, rumors were circulating that Henry planned to remarry, this time Jane Seymour. You might be thinking, great, I hope Anne gets angry. Things work out great when women refuse to tolerate poor treatment by their husbands and get really ballsy and just decide to take over the country. Did she do that? No, Anne did not stage a coup. So rather than divorcing the increasingly unfriendly Anne, Henry accused her of bewitching him and engaging in adulterous affairs. Anne was tried for a host of crimes, including plotting to poison Catherine and praying for the king's death, and she was found guilty. Despite supposedly remaining exquisitely calm in the courtroom and sentenced to death. At this point, Anne went about handling her breakup better than anyone else in history ever has or ever will. She apparently replied to the verdict with perfect composure. Lancelot de Carl wrote that Anne stepped forward and addressed the court. I do not say that I've always borne towards the king the humility which I owed him, considering his kindness and the great honor he showed me, and the great respect he always paid me. I admit, too, that often I've taken it into my head to be jealous of him, but may God be my witness if I have done him any other wrong. Henry did grant her request that she be executed by beheading with a sword, not an axe. People often remember this as some sort of chivalrous gesture. I remember my mom taking me to the Tower of London when I was 10 and telling me that Henry believed Anne Boleyn was too beautiful to be beheaded by an axe. Wow, he must have still loved her, I thought at the time, even though she was a witch. I no longer think that. I think now beheading people is bad, regardless of the instrument employed. Immediately after agreeing that Anne would be beheaded with a sword, Henry declared Elizabeth, their daughter, a bastard. All things considered, I think Anne probably would have traded the sword for not having their daughter declared illegitimate. But if she was furious, and she had every right to be, she never showed it. Right before her execution, she stood up and told everyone that Henry was a very nice guy. Her last words were, "Good Christian people, I come hitherto to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will not speak against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." My God, think of the way we talk about our exes today. We go on and on about how they were evil, manipulative, sociopathic narcissists because they cheated on us one time. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn was able to speak well about her ex when her head was on the chopping block. This story is about someone who did not do well with breakups. It's the story of Bluebeard. My aunts told me this story when I was way too young to hear it, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I became obsessed with it. As you will see, it's probably not the best story to be obsessed with when you're 8 or 9 years old. Bluebeard lived long, long ago. He was a very wealthy man, had lots of business interests, but people were a little bit afraid of him. No one really knew where he came from, and he had this beard that was so black it looked blue, and that made him look pale and haunted. Well, there was a poor family in town, and the oldest daughter needed to make a good match. So her mother arranged for her to marry Bluebeard. So this young woman, Anne, was understandably fairly nervous about marrying this mysterious person, but after the wedding, Bluebeard took her to his beautiful, beautiful home. He was very generous with her, gave her anything she wanted. She could have run of the place, beautiful libraries, wonderful food, and he was very gentle and kind with her. After about a month of marriage, Bluebeard told his bride that he was going to be going away for about 6 weeks. And he gave her this huge ring of keys and said, "These are the keys to every room in this house. You're free to go wherever you wish. You can have friends come over, have lavish parties, do whatever you like, enjoy yourself. But there's a very small key," and he pointed it out on the key ring. It was a tiny little silver key. He said, "This key opens a door on the main floor. You must promise to never use this key and never go into that room." So the young bride thought, no problem. Like, here's all these other beautiful rooms in the house, the rest, the grounds. She can certainly abide by not going in one little room. And for the most part, she forgot about that little key as she had parties, friends over, had balls at the house, all of this. But after a while, a few weeks, the friends had all gone home and she was alone in the house and started to get a little bit curious about this tiny key. So she searched around the ground floor to try and find the door. And eventually she found it. It was kind of tucked under a staircase. It was a pretty small door, fairly unassuming. And she looked at that key and she looked at that door and she thought, what's the harm? I'm just going to peek. He let me go into every single room in this house. There can't be anything in here that's different than anything else that I've seen. So she took her little key and she opened that door. And when she opened the door, the sight she saw chilled her to the bone. And this is the part of the story that I, young Michelle, became obsessed with. Because in that room were the bodies of Bluebeard's previous 5 wives. He had slit their throats. He had dismembered them. There was blood up the walls, on the floor. There was a huge vat with body parts in it. And our young bride just stood there frozen, in shock. And as she stood there, she dropped the keys to the floor. When she finally came to her senses, she quickly scooped up the ring of keys, ran out the door, locked it, and ran up to her room. Then she noticed that there was blood on that little silver key from when she had dropped it on the floor. So she started to scrub it off, but it wouldn't come off. It didn't matter how hard she scrubbed, what she used, the blood was still on that little key. So of course, as she was scrubbing, her husband came home from his weeks away, walks in the door, calls out to her, "Come down, I have wonderful gifts for you." So she comes down, and the first thing he asks for is for the ring of keys back. Well, what can she do? She has to give them back. You can't lose a big giant ring of keys. And immediately he notices the blood on the tiny key. "You went into that room when I forbade you from going into that room, and now you will spend the rest of your days in there, just like all the others." And he starts to drag her towards the tiny room, but she begs and begs and begs for time just to pray before he kills her. So he allows it. She goes into her room and she's praying and praying, keeps looking out the window. In the story, her brothers are supposed to be coming, but they never really explain why her brothers are coming. I find it kind of like, yay, she has to be rescued by her brothers, but whatever. So she keeps trying to get more time, but eventually Bluebeard starts to drag her out of the room, out of her bedroom, towards that tiny little room. And just as he's about to kill her, her brothers come bursting into the house, stab Bluebeard, cut him into little bits, and they all move into the house. I have no idea what they do with the horrible torture room, but the rest of them live happily ever after, living off of Bluebeard's riches. When my aunts told me this story, they actually finished it with Bluebeard chopping up his new bride, which I think was a much more interesting ending, but like I said, terribly inappropriate for an 8 or 9-year-old. So that is the story of Bluebeard. So I'm going to finish up with a real love story because I do actually believe in love. So this is the myth of Philemon and Baucus. So a long time ago, there was a Greek village called Phrygia in a valley. And the people of Phrygia had turned their backs on the rules of hospitality. They had become very arrogant and rude. And of course, this information got to the gods. So Zeus and Hermes decided to investigate. They disguised themselves as travelers and arrived in the village in the middle of a horrible storm. They went from house to house asking for hospitality, and they got kicked, cursed, insulted, and refused at every single home. So finally, they make their way to the edge of the village, and there's a tiny hut. It's the last house of the village, and it belongs to a very old couple, Philemon and Baucus. They had no children. They'd been together for years, dedicated to each other, and had very little. They had a goose and this tiny hut. So as Zeus and Hermes approach, Baucus was outside. She saw the travelers, and she quickly let them into the house. She brushed off a couple chairs for them. They were the only chairs in the house, and gave them to the travelers. They brought out their only table, and one leg was shorter than the other, so she kind of shoved a little tile underneath. They scrubbed the tabletop with mint to make it as nice as possible. And Philemon shook the guests' hands and welcomed them to their home. And the couple put together a very meager stew, but with absolutely everything they possibly had. Their vegetables from the garden, the last little bit of meat they had, as many herbs as they could, and they had one last jug of wine. And so they went to serve their guests and hoped that this would be enough for their guests. Now, Baucus noticed that after she filled up everyone's cup with the wine, that the wine jug was full again. So just to make sure, she poured everybody another cup of wine, and again it filled up. So she pulled her husband aside and said, "These have to be gods, and look what we're serving them. We have nothing. You should go and kill the goose so we can give these gods a proper meal." So she entertained the disguised Zeus and Hermes while her very old husband went out to try and catch and kill the goose. Well, the goose was much smarter and quicker than it looked, ran into the house, and flew onto Zeus's lap. So Zeus just laughed and said to the couple, "You do not need to kill your beloved goose for us. Come with us right now." So the couple weren't sure what was going on. They knew these were gods, but they didn't know who they were. So Zeus and Hermes led them to the top of a hill, and when they turned around, the entire valley was flooded, and their home had been turned into a great temple. So when they looked back at the travelers, they could see it was Zeus and Hermes. So Zeus basically said, in appreciation of your amazing hospitality, we'd like to grant you a wish. So the old couple asked to be priests for the gods in that temple and spend the rest of their lives serving the gods. Zeus says, "Yes, done. Anything else?" And then Philemon said, "Please let us die at the same time." He said, "I can't stand the idea of Baucus burying me, and I can't stand the idea of me standing at Baucus's graveside." So Zeus said, "Yes, done. When it's time for you to die, you'll die at the exact same time." So they spend the rest of their relatively few years they had left serving the gods in that beautiful temple. And one day, Philemon turned around and noticed his wife wasn't moving anymore. She was starting to sprout roots in the ground. So he slowly made his way to her, put his arms around her, and as they died and said goodbye to each other, they turned into trees. So they became an oak tree and a linden tree that grew out of the same trunk, all twisted around each other so they could be together forever. And apparently the lake is still there, and you can still find that tree, or rather two trees twisted together for all eternity. So isn't that lovely? It's such a lovely story of love and devotion. But of course, they still died, and they're trees twisted around each other. So even if they wanted to get away from each other, they never could. So I suppose that's a nice story to end on. Thank you for joining me for Love Stinks Story Times for Grown-Ups. We'll be back next month. Now I'm going to go eat a pint of ice cream. Good night.